This panel is moderated by Dr. Peter Hartley. Peter is a Baker Scholar and also the George and Cynthia Mitchell Chair in the Economics Department. Has a long history of working with me specifically on issues related to electricity and natural gas, and I think that's going to sort of be self-evident, his knowledge of this as he moderates this panel with our very distinguished panelists. You might notice in your program that Gabriel Alonso, who's the CEO of EDP Renewables, is listed. He unfortunately had to send his regrets. He could not join us due to some last-minute organizational changes within the company. But he sends his regrets and hoped that we would progress nicely without him, and I think we will. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Peter.
Thank you very much. There we go. Thank you very much, Ken. So this morning we talked a little bit about energy transitions, and I think it was pretty clear that if we're going to transition from fossil fuels to alternatives, the really big part is going to be played by the power sector. Even you think about transport, I guess people talked about electric vehicles. The other alternatives that were discussed were biofuels and hydrogen, but the hydrogen's got to come from somewhere too, so I'm not sure about that even. So I think most people believe that if we're going to transition from fossil fuels at some point, the electricity sector is going to play a really important role. And of course, in addition, the power sector at the moment itself is still undergoing tremendous transition. I mean, we had the institutional reforms in the power sector, the splitting the vertically integrated utilities, but now we're all continuing to see tremendous change within the sector, mainly driven by technology. So we're going to talk about some of these issues here this morning. I've got three panelists and the order they're going to speak. First we're going to see John Berger from Sonova. He has more than 20 years experience in the power industry. More details about his bio are in your the conference pamphlet. Not only has he been at Sonova Corp, but he's prior to Sonova, he co-founded and served as Chief Executive Officer at SunCap Financial, a leading residential solar power service company. And then we're going to hear from Joe Dominguez, who's from Exelon. Leads the development implementation of federal, state and regional government regulatory and public policy strategies for Exelon, one of the nation's largest electric companies with approximately $27 billion in revenue. John is going to present some slides. Joe is just going to make some introductory remarks. Then we're going to have Elaine Walsh from Baker Botts. She counsels clients regarding energy company mergers, energy asset acquisitions, divestitures and investments, as well as the development of electric generation and fuel transportation and storage projects. Advises independent power producers, renewable energy, oil and gas companies, utility, coal company and power marketer clients in electricity and fuel trading and marketing activities. Elaine will also give a few remarks. Then we have some questions. I've prepared some questions for the three panelists. And then we're also going to take questions from the audience if you write them down on the cards. So first I'll invite John to make his presentation and give us some remarks.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Good morning. I was brought here to liven things up a little bit. If you don't have a lot of questions and feel uncomfortable, then I've done a terrible job at the end of this. In all seriousness, what I do want is we are the only major solar company in Houston, and I think that's going to change. But right now, shall we say, I'm the black sheep of the family. There are a lot of things that I'm going to say and offer up that are going to challenge a lot of the conventional wisdoms that do fit in this room and in this city. I think it's important to constantly question, especially when you are a CEO or you are a leader in the government, your assumptions and test it against the data that you see coming forth. Now, data can be twisted, but if you constantly question as you move ahead, I think you're more likely to come out in a better place and in the best place, hopefully. And so at the end, what I hope is that if nothing else, you can come back in and say, no, my initial assumptions were all true. Forget that guy. Or you can say, maybe there's a few things I need to think about a little bit more. Maybe I'm not all certain about these things. And then some of you may just become radically like me and want to go out and start a competing company to Sonova. So either way, I think it's well worth your time, and certainly I will say this. I know there is a lot of, having been born in Texas, grown up in Texas, have a wife, 4 kids down the street here in West U, I understand that there is a lot of hostility to being, quote, green. I will tell you, I have no hostility to hydrocarbons, none. They are necessary. They built a great country. They built the world and civilization, and there is no hostility to it. Now, the facts are that there are issues and so forth with some of the emissions and so forth there, but some are better than others. Natural gas versus coal, for instance. But I do not hate hydrocarbons, and in fact, what you'll see here is I think there is still a role to be played in here, but I do feel like the industry is going to be dramatically different in a much faster fashion than what you currently are thinking now, for the most part. All right. First of all, my company. This is my 3rd solar company. I sold the other 2. One to the last one to an unnamed major IPP that has headquarters in 2 places. But hopefully that'll be fixed at some point soon if anybody's in the audience there. But Sonova Energy, very simply, is the country's largest residential solar service provider. And I'm proud to say we're the only one that's profitable. Profitable. The fact that we're located in Texas and the only one that's profitable, I don't think is a coincidence. What we do is simply through a network of dealers like a DirecTV does, or what an ADT on home security, is we go out, we source customers that want to save money. On average, we now are saving about 30% to 33% off the year 1 bills from the power companies, in roughly about 25 U.S. states and territories. Those dealers install our equipment, and then we have long-term contracts, 25 years, where we're obligated to maintain the equipment and sell the power to the homeowner. We are a power company. We are an energy company. We're not a finance company. We're not a technology company. We use technology, but that's no different than a Schlumberger or an Exxon or an EOG or anybody else that uses technology, as was discussed in the last panel. Now, we range from Guam, Saipan, all the way through Hawaii, California, to Texas, to Puerto Rico. I'll get to that in a little bit of what's going on there, and our hearts and prayers are with the people of Puerto Rico going through this very, very difficult time, and we cannot move fast enough to give them aid. And I will tell you about what Sonova is doing there in a very small way and trying to help. But we range all the way up to Massachusetts. So the idea, if it's not really sunny, i.e. if it's not Texas or Arizona, it doesn't work, that's factually inaccurate. And there's a lot of other fallacies that I'll go through and talk about. But basically, we are a service provider. Think of us as wireless power. That's the way to think about us. We're selling power without the need of wires. Now, one thing, and this is a concept that I pulled from somebody else a couple of years ago, and I noticed a lot of things were being assumed and data quoted as far as what's going to happen with regards to electric vehicles and so forth. What I will tell you, what I think is fundamentally missing in that analysis, is that there are multi-variables, and that change, disruption, which I think is a term used too much, but it does apply to the energy business. That disruption is not done by one technology, but a confluence of technologies that happen to hit at the same time. If you look at the late 80s and certainly 90s and the telecommunications and the media industries, they were not just disrupted by the cellular technology, But it was the internet, it was chip technologies, it was even battery technologies to some degree, but there was a lot of different technologies that came to bear. If you look at the cell phone that's in your pocket right now, that does far more than just, be able to have phone calls come in and go out. Yet we still call it a cell phone. It's a computer. And so what we're seeing right now, and I see it, I can answer questions later, see it in the trenches, is solar has come down since my first company, little than 9 years ago, almost 95% in cost. 95%. Cost reductions when you have a solid state or technology do not go linear. And I'll get into the fundamental mistakes that a lot of folks made, probably some in this room, and I was too conservative too, I'll tell you that, and in looking at what happened with solar and how'd you miss it. Because it's still getting more efficient in terms of energy density, and it's still going down in cost. But 95% in less than 9 years, I think we can all agree, is a dramatic change on the order of what we have seen in fracking technology. So solar in many cases, and really in all cases, is the cheapest energy source on the planet. I already see some heads shaking. No, that ain't right. It is. What is still the cheapest is the storage of the BTU. That is still the cheapest done by hydrocarbons, oil, natural gas, and so forth. So when you look at the Achilles heel for us, it is the storage of energy. Now, it was talked about as a 60-to-1 ratio, I think was mentioned earlier. That's true, although what I'll get to is the conversion from that oil to the actual energy that run the car is incredibly inefficient compared to an electric motor. So there's a balance here. There's a balance. Now, what we're seeing is that the battery technology, and I was just over in China 6 weeks ago, they're obviously very involved in it, as the Japanese are, and the Taiwanese, and the Koreans, and the Americans, okay, and many other countries. That battery technology is getting better and is coming down the cost curve fast, very fast. What's pushing that is electric vehicles that are being adopted. And I will tell you, be very careful, and I'll talk about this in our business in just a second. People are buying electric vehicles in Houston. I get, even on the way here, I ran, not literally, thank God, but I ran into 3 or 4 Teslas. Why did those people buy the Tesla? Did they buy it because gasoline was really expensive at whatever, $2.38 a gallon? No, they bought it because it served them differently than what an ICE car could do, an internal combustion engine. They like the computerization. They like the software download. They like the massive acceleration. It is a product that's getting cheaper too. It does a better job for the consumer. It does a different service. They valued oil at zero. At zero. And I want you to think a lot about that. Now, what the EVs are doing on a global basis, there's been a lot of press releases with LG and a lot of other firms, Mercedes, on building massive battery factories here in the US. I will tell you, the Chinese are very far ahead. I understand that you had on the opening address a gentleman be able to say that, Robert. He is dead on right. They are very, very far ahead of us, and we need to catch up. But catching up doesn't mean excluding them. We should actually learn from them and then take advantage of it, move forward in this country. But the battery scale up there on the manufacturing side is mind-blowing. There are companies that you have never heard of that are building massive billion-dollar facilities that are ramping up the batteries in a very quick fashion. Now, what that's doing in my business is we are then seeing storage collapse in price. We will move, and we are moving right now as fast as we can, to collect batteries globally and send them into Puerto Rico so that we can light up our customers' homes, numbering 10,000, without the grid, because the grid's not going to be there anytime soon. This is the whole world will focus on Puerto Rico as an example of what not the future, but the present and where we are, not where we're going, but where we are and what we're capable of doing. That cost curve is therefore in the batteries is going to collapse much faster because the EVs need a lower price to be competitive, way lower than what I need in places like Hawaii, Guam, Saipan, California, Puerto Rico, and soon to be even in the Northeast and even in Texas. By the way, I have batteries in my home in West U down the road. What EVs will also get a push in, and this is why the 2 billion car number, and you can quote me on this, will never happen. There is simply not enough space if you've been to Beijing, Shanghai, in any place in India and Brazil to have that many cars on the road. The pollution is overwhelming. And I'm not going to get on a high horse again about pollution and hydrocarbons and all that. What I'm saying is that it doesn't work. They're going to move forward. If you look at what the millennials are doing, we've got some of them in the audience, the amount of car ownership, if you can see this through apartments in Chicago and in Houston, is dropping. That is a big change. And so when you talk about this natural growth in terms of oil demand, you will not see it. What will happen is self-driving cars at some point, and it'll be different for each country, will come in, and the technology is there today to do some basic automation, as we all know, and that will then be incorporated into Uber, into Lyft, into Enterprise. I heard an article that actually Enterprise was learning, and this was on NPR earlier this week, here in Houston on Harvey about how to respond so that they use that data in terms of how they responded to the hurricane to actually help them, enable them to get ready for self-driving cars or autonomous vehicles. This is going to happen. When? It's probably going to happen faster than most people think, certainly within the next 5 to 6 years. So all these technologies are coming together. So trying to analyze the impact of each one individually, you will be wrong. You need to look at them collectively and moving together. Now, here, I put this very simple diagram up. On the left is a historical. This is where the industry currently, or has been and currently is, where the grid is the power supply, and that's it, the. What we were moving towards, and on the right, by the way, this is my house down the road. These are houses that we have in terms of customers in Guam, Saipan, Hawaii, and soon to be, hopefully, in vast numbers in Puerto Rico. You'll notice, as I point out, by the way, all of my shareholders made their money in oil and gas, and I'm very proud of that. I get vilified in the industry for that, but I work hard to get the money out of you guys, and I'm going to continue to do that. And I always point out, notice, I don't know, Bobby Tudor, if he's still here, notice there's still natural gas here. There's still natural gas. And there's natural gas that's going to come out of that grid because the centralized power plants are the ones, the best ones there are the ones fired by natural gas. They're the most efficient, the most cost effective. This becomes, there's a buzzword that's going on right now in Washington in the industry, resiliency. They even say that natural gas is not good enough for resiliency. Natural gas is a very good fuel. And if you look at true resiliency and you ask all of us in Houston, in Florida, in Puerto Rico, resiliency is when a hurricane comes in, knocks the power lines down, and the folks at the utilities are working hard to fix it up, but you still have power. That's resiliency. And that's where we are going very quickly, because that can deliver a better service, a higher quality of service, higher reliability at a better price. And in a free market, which the power industry is not, and we'll get to that, in a free market, you deliver a better service at a better price, you win, right? That's capitalism. That's what this country was built on. That's what Texas leads in, is capitalism. So this is where we see the industry going in a very quick fashion. Now, in the terms of the transformation, you can look at, here's all the Here's the current graph, if you will, about what's going on or where we've been and then where we're going. And what I would also like to say is that a couple of different things. One, technology moves in an S-curve. And so we'll get into that in terms of major mistakes here in just a minute. But technology is never adopted in linear fashion. Never. Never. So those of you who are picking a number, I don't care what it is, 8%, 9%, I get 10% EVs by 2040 or 15 or 20, that's all bogus math. The reality, it's either going to be 0 or it's going to be a lot more than that. Because that is what happens over the last, 500 years. That's what's going to happen. Now, if you look at what does this mean, when you look at all the things that we're talking about, and by the way, I will tell you, I absolutely think the industry, the oil and gas industry, is going to get far more efficient. So I'll go out there and be aggressive on pricing and so forth. I was told earlier this week by a very well-known geologist that 95% of the water and the sand used in fracking is wasted. He thinks he can get that down to 10. Even if he's only halfway right, gas could go to $1.50 an M, or at least $1.75 an M, and everybody would still make a lot of money. I think that's going to happen. I'm pretty certain of it, because I believe in the ingenuity of the oil and gas industry. Therefore, I think oil is going to come down in cost more dramatically as well. Now, prices follow the marginal cost. So this means we need to be prepared for $25 oil at some point, not talking about the next couple of years, but at some point in the next 5 years, and we need to be prepared for $2 or sub gas. But I think we're up for the challenge. Now, in the power business, which is going to increasingly have natural gas displace coal and nuke, neither one of them are cost effective, that means that the price of electricity should go down, right? Should go down. So, John, you're in deep trouble, because we're going to just kill it in costs, and you're in deep trouble. No, I'm not. Let's take a 6,000 heat rate, which is a little aggressive, but you can go 6,000 to 7,000 on a combined cycle gas plant, modern, and you take a $3, which is where the gas price is right now. That's $18 a megawatt hour. 6 times 3 is 18. And candidly, in the low 20s, that's about where the wholesale market is in Texas right now because of that. You cut the price of gas in half. Now, it's roughly, let's call it $9, $10 a megawatt hour. Translate that into the retail rate. That's roughly about 1 penny that you saved. My average retail rate in the United States, the average, is 15.5 cents. I don't care. I care. I mean, I want to see the companies, oil and gas companies, thrive and succeed, particularly in Houston. But it will not impact the economics. Why? Why won't it impact the economics? Because there's this little company entity in between called the poles and wires in the utility, and they are not at all, even in Houston, shown market price signals. They can spend money, and they spend money to make money. Are they evil people? No. Do I hate them? No. I want to work with them. But it is the construct we've set up. We must change. We must deregulate. We must put capitalism in the system so that the price signals can be sent so that we can change accordingly. And the market will work. For the first time, and think about this, since Thomas Edison created the power industry in the United States, for the first time we have a technology that is a distributed fuel and a distributed conversion technology from BTU to kilowatt hour. That is solar. It is a game changer because of that. There's been nothing else like it since Thomas Edison. Even the first Niagara Falls plant was centralized in nature. Batteries are obviously inherently distributed as well, because every one of you has one in your pocket with the cell phone. That matters big time. and it's changing a lot of things. And this transformation is totally dependent upon it. So if you think solar and wind belong together, you're wrong. Maybe they're clean. We can make an argument whether each one's clean or not. I'm not going to make that argument, and I don't really care either way. What I'm saying is that solar as a technology is going to continue to drive down in cost, as well as batteries, and they're distributed so people can make individual decisions and not have public utility commissions make them for them. Now, quickly, probably going to take up more of my time, but let me tell you about some of the mistakes I've made, and I've seen others made real fast in looking at solar. One, as I mentioned earlier, extrapolate current technology performance and cost in linear fashion. Hey, John, it's too expensive, batteries are too expensive, why do I care about this? The least payback period in the power industry is 25-year payback for a combined cycle gas plant. Okay, everything else is north of that. So if you're making investment decisions, you need to be mindful that, well, it may not be this year or next year or even the year after, it's coming pretty fast in terms of performance increases, but more importantly, price decreases. So do not think in linear fashion. Market share versus business quality. I think this is a really important point. Are you saying oil's going away? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that if you look at the coal industry over the last few years and what gas did to it, not solar, what gas did to it, you would say that the coal industry and being in that business was terrible. Every one of the coal companies went bankrupt except one. It's a terrible business. And so when you look at this from a CEO's perspective or investor's perspective, you would say, I don't really care how the market share goes down. I just care that it is and that the business is bad. So talking about being the last guy or woman to sell the last molecule or last ton of coal, I don't want to be the guy selling the last kilowatt hour coming off a solar panel, turn out the lights literally and go. You want to get out of that business ahead of time. So that's the context I want you to think about this. Underestimating the consumer. If there is a better service at a better price, the consumers will move and move faster than you think, particularly in a commodity environment. So be careful of that. Underestimating people's changes. For instance, I remember the days when people would go, buy online? No, my credit card's going to get ripped off. That's crazy. I want to see it. Who's going to do that? Amazon. That ain't going to work. Now Amazon, now they're talking about, are they going to eat everything? That wasn't that long ago. And do not assume there needs to be a major physical, Manhattan Project breakthrough. That was a big mistake in the solar industry, and it's being made yet again in the battery industry. It doesn't need to happen, and when you look at what's going to happen, incrementalism every single year adds up. Pennies add up. Especially in Houston, we ought to know that. We're very cost conscious. That's why we're very successful. Pennies add up. Remember that. The last point here is what stands in our way. What stands in our way is that we have a system in the power industry in the United States that's not open, that's not free, that's not capitalistic. That's nobody's fault. I'm not here to vilify anybody, any company at all. It's been that way for over 100 years, and it worked then, but it does not work now. And everybody knows it. The people at FERC, the people at NERC, the people at the individual PUCs of most of the states in this country, the people even in the utilities understand that change needs to happen. The political will, that's a different story. How do you deal with this? It's very complex, but here's the thing. Technology will move faster than regulators, certainly the pace that they're moving right now. And we need to move. We have to. And once you give price signals to people, then all of what we're talking about will sort itself out and consumers will win, because everything is inuring to the benefit of consumers. Fracking technology, solar technology, battery technology, everything's inuring to the benefit of the consumer. What I'll also tell you is, because I know I'm going to get the question, I was the lone CEO in the solar industry that campaigned actively at the highest levels of the federal government to not extend the investment tax credit on solar. Yes, I got a lot of friendly calls telling me I could do some things with myself and all kinds of things. And I'm not very popular in the solar industry, but I don't care. I'm here to make money. And the reason why I oppose the subsidy is that governments distort markets. Get it out of here, and we need to take a lesson from the oil and gas industry. When the price of a barrel fell, did we sit around there and go, well, I still need $3 million or $4 million or $10 million to drill a well, frack a well? No, we said, well, shoot, how are we going to get the price down? How are we going to get the costs down? Because the prices have fallen. We need to see that signal in the solar business. We can do a lot better. The costs that you're seeing out there are a mirage that are set up by the government with the best intentions. But when you subsidize something as a percentage of cost, you shouldn't be surprised that the cost doesn't go down. Get the subsidies out of the energy business completely. Nukes should not be subsidized, nothing should be subsidized, and let's see what consumers want. If they do not want solar and batteries like I just laid out, then I will go away, and I'll go beg a job from one of you in the oil business. I have 4 kids, just remember that, please. But we need to have the price signals. We need to see the competition. And why do I think that's important for Houston? We laid the country, and indeed the world, in oil and gas. Our best resource is not the ship channel. It is not certainly our flat land. It is our people. We are the best entrepreneurs in the entire country, especially in energy. We know energy. We should own every bit of it. We should not politicize whether it's solar or oil and gas or nuclear or whatever it is that comes out. We should then embrace it. We should then lead it. And we should own the future of energy. And I know that Houston is going to do just that. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much for a very stimulating presentation. Next, we're going to hear from Joseph.
Can you hear me?
There we go.
Okay. My name's Joe Dominguez. I work for Exelon. I lead policy development, wholesale and retail market policy development for that company. For those of you who are unfamiliar with us, we are comprised of a number of companies that John just vilified. I did vilify. It's always funny when somebody says, I really don't have a problem with this particular business, and then goes on to destroy it and pretend we didn't hear that. In any event, we have 6 major utilities. We are the utility company in Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Atlantic City, and parts of Delaware, including Wilmington. So we're very familiar with the changes in technology. On the generation side, we own, and we're known for owning, the largest nuclear fleet in the country. Nuclear produces about 67% of the nation's zero-carbon electricity. Hydro comes next at about 28%, and I think wind is 10 or so percent. I think solar's 1 or 2 or 3%. So we do understand that solar is coming and other technologies are coming, but as we think about decarbonization and other things, there's going to be a big continuing role for the nuclear fleet. That's not the sole generation resource we have. We have combined cycle plants. We just built 2 state-of-the-art facilities here in Texas. John actually accurately described some of the qualities of those plants, 6,000 heat rate machines that could easily produce electricity for $18 megawatt hour. We have the largest retail company in the industry, where we have over 2 million customers. And frankly, I think we've installed more solar at those customer applications and storage than most all of the other distributed solar companies. So we have familiarity with all of these different technologies. As I indicated, I think very, very clearly these different technologies are coming into the business. We could all debate the speed in which this transformation is going to occur. I think stepping back from some of the anecdotes and looking at the statistics will tell us that we're probably around 10 to 15 years away from a massive transformation. I think some of the battery storage technology is going to have to get beyond lithium before it really competes with the internal combustion engine. But it really, economics doesn't necessarily matter. As has been indicated, state sponsorship is what has mattered. So what has caused the transition in places that you talked about, like Massachusetts, is not the economics of solar, let's be real. It's the fact that the governor of Massachusetts signed a law mandating its entry into the market. And likewise in other states in the country, where we have over 30 states with RPS standards that mandate as a percentage of retail load that renewables play some proportionate share. Quite obviously, those laws would not be required if it were a free market and if economics were driving all of the decisions. But as I said, it is the reality. State sponsorship's the reality. Concerns around climate are the reality. The storms that unfortunately have affected our country over the course of these last couple of months are continuing a dialogue that really has never ceased. And it's a dialogue that is occurring at the policymaker level, but really also at the customer level, where choices are being made to get to resources that provide different resilience qualifications and different environmental attributes. And I think that's going to continue. I'm going to let Elaine go next here and finish up the speeches. I know there's a lot of good questions that we as panel members participated in framing. I think it's going to get at some of the necessary changes. John alluded to some of those. I'd be glad to share my perspective on those as we get going. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we're next to hear from Elaine.
Thank you both. So my name is Elaine Walsh. I'm a partner at Baker Botts in Washington, D.C. And like any good lawyer, I am going to not be controversial. Anyway, I appreciate the viewpoints of my other panelists, and I think most certainly in the power sector, we have to be in all of the above type of industry. I don't see how it could go, certainly back to the old regulated model, or frankly go forward and do without the utilities. I mean, my personal view is that the so-called utility death spiral is highly overrated. I think that there is room for everyone in the electricity market. As Robert noted in the keynote address, the U.S., at least in the hydrocarbon side, was focused on supply. In the power sector, we focused on supply during the deregulation in 97 and 98, although I think a lot of us in the business would like to think of it as re-regulation, not necessarily deregulation. But that was a focus then. Then things started focusing on demand, efficiency response, demand response resources, how do they participate in the electricity markets. And now I think, especially with some of the unfortunate weather events that we've had, the tragedies in Puerto Rico and Houston and Florida, I think the focus does have to be more on delivery. How do we get the electricity to the customers? And whether it's with T&D, which I think there's definitely there still is going to be hard wires, at least for quite a while. But in other areas, how do we do without that? How is that possible? How do we invest in more distributed energy? What's sufficient? What's the right way to invest? Who's going to pay for those resources? I think those all are important questions. And as we see technology developing, hopefully that'll become more clear. But again, I think that's going to be all part of the solution. And our panel, I was joking with Jason Bennett, my partner, well, you got global oil. How come we didn't get global power? Well, I think part of it is because power is local. A lot of the markets are local. So the solution for Puerto Rico, the solution for Florida, the solution for Texas, that might not be the same as the solution for California, the solution for the Mid-Atlantic and PJM, the solution for the Midwest. All of those areas, they have different generation resources. Some of them have more wind, some of them have more solar. They certainly have different state utility commissions that are pushing, frankly, some different agendas, different incentives. And they have, different load, and they have different infrastructure and different threats. I mean, certainly in Houston, I think, I don't know, living in DC, and then we went through some storms a while back, and most of our lines are above ground. And I tell you, I never realized how much I took the power for granted until we had Hurricane Isabel, and we had no power in August for a week. It was awful. But then I think, oh wow, Pepco, they should bury all their lines, right? That's the answer. And then you see folks in Florida and Houston where they had buried lines, and then the flooding knocked out their power. So, anyway, it's just each area is different, and they have to figure out what works for them. And I think those of you that participate in the power markets, you understand that we have different RTOs, different organized markets in the regions, and some of their solutions can be different. I mean, I think it's important that we have common principles, like what's the proper price formation, how resources get compensated for their reliability attributes, how they help the grid be stable. And so there are going to be some common things across the markets, but I do think there's room for, certainly different ideas and different incentives, and hopefully different areas can learn from each other.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to pick up on some of the things that have already been said with some questions, and I trust that you're all thinking of some better questions than we all thought of, or I thought of. But I'm going to start out, I guess, partly where Elaine finished, and this has already been touched on by John too, which is given our experience with the hurricane here and the one in Puerto Rico. I mean, this issue of the resilience of supply, I think, is very important as more and more people move to the coasts. And we become much more dependent on electricity as our main energy source. The issue of the reliability of that supply in the face of particularly hurricanes or storms with strong winds becomes an issue. How do we go about sort of handling that? I know John's already said he's got wireless power, except I noticed his diagram wasn't truly wireless. He still had a connection to the wire. So,
answer for that.
So but I'll be interested to hear what he has to say about that. But also, the other issue, I guess, is the institutional one. I mean, we've split the wires company from the distributors. Who's responsible for the wires? And should we go below ground? If we do, who's going to handle the expense of that? Some of these kinds of issues. I'd like to hear what you've all got to say. I don't know who would like to go first.
It sounds like a Joe question to me.
Well, sure. I'll start out. I mentioned where we do business and the cities we do business. So for a large cross-section of our customer base, whether they're rich or poor, they don't have a rooftop to put a solar panel on. They're living in multi-dwelling households in the city. We serve, of the 10 million, just to give you some numbers, of the 10 million customers we serve, and we're the largest electric utility in the country with that base, about 7.5 million of those customers live in areas where, for a variety of reasons, or a variety of their own financial circumstances, solar and storage are just not going to be an option in the near term. So the grid has to continue to provide power for those customers, and we need to continue to strengthen the grid. Notwithstanding the impact of these storms, I think what's fairly remarkable, both in Texas and Pennsylvania, or in Florida, pardon me, is the speed with which the grid got back on its feet. This is hopefully a relatively infrequent occurrence, and the grid has recovered relatively quickly in those areas. I think Puerto Rico's a different animal. Those of you who are familiar with the business understand that the economy in Puerto Rico, the government in Puerto Rico, has been suffering for a great period of time. They stopped doing maintenance on their system a few years ago. The fact that it's an island and you can't get resources there the way we could here in Texas and the way we did in Florida, I think is going to be a real humanitarian challenge in those areas and an industry challenge. But the conversation around resilience that is actually occurring at the Department of Energy, I think, is less about ensuring that people have solar panels and storage devices, but rather how we anticipate potential disruptions of the grid. Historically, when we think about either capacity planning or when we think about the way we dispatch the energy system on a daily basis, we think of two major contingencies. And if you've heard of the NERC N-1 criteria, that simply means normal minus one element. When we recently have gone to N-1 which means the grid has to operate if you have two major components go out of your normal configuration. And the way we've thought about that historically is a large power plant failing or a large transmission line failing. Increasingly, as we transition to an electric sector that has power plants that also depend on an interstate system, the gas pipeline system, we have to anticipate either deliberate or accidental or weather-related disruptions of the natural gas pipeline system. I'll give you some numbers there. It's pretty scary. In contrast to an N-1 standard that may take out 2,000 or 3,000 megawatts of power simultaneously, a major gas pipeline disruption in the Northeast could take out 10 to 20 gigawatts of power. Presently, we're not planning for that. So if you're familiar with the work that the Department of Energy just did over the last 3 or 4 months, it released a report in August, you'll see that their principal concern is keeping the grid operational in the event of a gas pipeline failure that for a protracted period of time eliminates our ability to serve load with natural gas-fired machines. So I think that's the resiliency discussion. I don't think it has ended. What the department has called for and what the Trump administration is doing is asking all of the RTOs to do a very detailed analysis of that issue. We've done a lot of gas electricity coordination work over the last 4 or 5 years, but that is a significant concern for us in the business, and it's frankly what we think about when we're talking resilience right now.
Well, what I would say is, when you look at the grid, at the end of the day, it's a single strand of wire. And, you know, when, Elaine, when you lost power at your house, or I've lost it in Ike, the problem is that you're not going to have a truly resilient grid system until the generation is matched with the load. Now, you've rightly said that that can't always be done, and I totally agree with that. And I do feel like that the larger structures, the downtown office buildings and so forth, where if you can look at it in the tariffs with the advent of the gas turbine in the late 60s and as we're going in the 70s, the price per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour that was charged, that burden went to the smaller loads, namely the residential and the small commercial customer. Because there was a lot of industrials, including down at the ship channel, that threatened to cut the cord because they could just order turbines from GE and then get the gas directly and become their own islands or mini grid systems that's been talked about. And so it was a natural response. What I'm saying is that the good thing that's happening now for those residential customers, and we only serve residential customers, is that we now have our own technologies that can come back in and have a pushback on the rates. So to be clear, in my house, and I'll answer this, Peter, I think what's best for society is to integrate. And again, Joe, I do not hate the utilities and vilify them. What I'm saying is that the market needs to see a response to the price of the T&D, and that was the question you asked, and that just because somebody comes up with it and it doesn't make them bad or good, doesn't mean that we just accept it. There has to be competition. There has to be a price response. That is a different system than what we have now and what we've had historically. And what I'm saying is technology is here. It's not in the future. It's here. We should set that regulatory construct up to give homeowners and small business owners that visibility to price and to competition. That's all I'm saying. And the technology moving to the endpoints of the system is going to make the system truly more resilient. I think that the grid should stay in place. I think that it is a good sunk cost system that with a more competitive charges in terms of O&M can provide levels of service to folks that you're right, I can't provide service to right now, given the energy density of panels and batteries, like the downtown office towers. So I think there's a way to find a way that's a meeting in the middle of the road that makes the system truly more resilient, which is not exactly what the government was really the administration was really talking about. They were really talking about bringing coal and nuke back at the expense of natural gas. Now, to their credit, huge credit, we put a press release on this. Secretary Perry in the Department of Energy came out and stated the facts, that really wasn't as a problem, that we do need to focus more on how do we have new technologies, both in the transmission and distribution system and in solar and batteries and so forth, to push those to the endpoints of the system and match load to truly make the system more resilient. To not change the definition of resiliency, but to keep it to what you just said, Joe, and what I just said, or at least a combination of the two, that if the power flows in a more reliable fashion, that's resiliency.
Could I just look? I think so much of this, when we talk at a certain level, kind of gets missed. I think we have, as I said earlier, about as many solar customers as anybody does. And in terms of the number of places where they could survive without the grid, without the wire that's connected to John's home for a significant period of time, operate the equipment that they have at the facility, is this. Okay? The reality is, for a big home, if you're starting your air conditioning unit and other things, it's beyond the capability of the current systems to provide that sort of power. So it's a great speaking point that as we distribute solar around the grid, it's going to become more resilient and somehow be this emergency resource. The facts on the ground, at least right now, don't necessarily support that proposition. But the more fundamental question is this. It's in pricing. And this is probably where you ought to hear where John and I might have a disagreement about this. We all agree that there should be transparent pricing. But I'm going to give you an example here for a moment. It's this fellow that's right in front of me. I'm going to make him the dividing line in the room. All of you on this side of the room have houses that, for whatever reason, you either don't want solar on the roof or you can't have it for the reasons we talked about. All of you have it. In the view of the electric utility, from a T&D standpoint, a transmission and distribution standpoint, I'm building the same wires to your house as I'm building to your house, because I'm going to surprise you with something. There's this phenomena called nighttime that happens almost every day. And there are other events, places I do business, where snow falls on top of solar panels, where there's emergency work that, these systems break, and they depend on the grid. Right now, we have a volumetric method of recovering the cost. The 13 or 15 cents that he referred to is that volumetric charge. And as we have more of you use your solar, you're not paying that volumetric charge. Let's say it's 12 hours of the day that you don't have to pay that volumetric charge. You don't pay all of a sudden for half of the cost that I incurred building the wires to your house. I'm a monopoly business, so it's not like we're going to take a loss. So guess who gets that charge? You do. And so increasingly in this area, what we're really talking about is not the transparent way to do this. We all believe in that, but ensuring that all customers who utilize the system pay for what they utilize. And that's the dispute. And so if we thought about T&D charges that way, that costs follow cost causers, and you cause as much cost as you, then that 15 cents that John talked about avoiding before doesn't get avoided. That's the real discussion going on at public utility commissions. How to be fair, in our case, to the 75% of customers that can't get solar and don't want to be stuck paying the bill for, frankly, what is mostly white people in the suburbs, okay? So there's a social dimension to this that is frequently talked about that is a problem. It doesn't make us enemies of one another, but it's a complicated problem that we have to solve. And if you believe what I just said, then solar really isn't competing against a 15-cent rate. The structure right now unfairly benefits solar through, effectively, is a cross-subsidization between customer classes. They're paying so that you don't have to pay. So I was pleased to hear that John wants to outlaw subsidies in the business, and I guess it's how we interpret those things where we've historically had some friction points. But we're here to talk about policy. That's one of the major policy issues that we confront, and we have to resolve fairly. And if I think we do resolve that fairly, John, there's probably attributes that the solar system provides from an environmental perspective and other things that we have to add into that equation. Those are the debates that are going around public utility commissions. We're talking up here, that's where this is really happening, okay? My perspective.
Elaine, would you like to have a go first, and then maybe we'll come back with each other?
No, I think it's certainly an interesting topic, and that I don't know if anybody's come up with a really good solution at the state utility commissions yet. But I think the cross-subsidization is a huge issue, and in fact, I think it's probably even worse than some of the things you were talking about, because even like if you have people on this side of the room that are not, that that don't purchase solar, then you also have low-income customers who can't pay that extra charge. So it might even be a quarter of the room then that's cross-subsidizing, or that's subsidizing the rest. So I think it's definitely a tough question. But we're watching the utility commission proceedings, and I think it'll be interesting to see how it turns out.
I guess I'll jump in one little bit and make one comment as an economist that I mean, the heart of this issue you're just talking about, this pricing issue, is that the price signal that we currently see, the consumers currently see, doesn't reflect the structure of costs. So, the point is that there are fixed elements of the cost that are independent of the amount of electricity you buy, and there are other elements of the cost that depend on the amount of electricity you buy. And currently they're all bundled together as if all costs depended on the amount of electricity you buy. And so when you buy less, you're contributing less to paying those fixed costs. And so having a pricing structure that doesn't reflect the nature of cost, this fixed component and the variable component, sends a distorted signal. And so we end up with so going back to John's point, you want to have a market where people are responding to prices in an efficient kind of way. You want the structure of prices to be correct.
Yes.
But sort of moving on, I guess, would you like to sort of say more about it first? Or?
Well, I mean, in response to you, Joe, one, I made it very clear that solar does not store. So what I'm talking about is a combination of solar and batteries do work at night. I can tell you that. Second of all, it's my turn to talk.
How many of your customers have that? You clearly don't.
Yeah, but what I was also going to say is I'm talking about forward prices that are going down dramatically. So today, I acknowledge that point. I acknowledge it up there. I'll acknowledge it again for you. But prices are changing dramatically, okay?
Fair enough.
Cross-subsidization is inherent in your monopoly business model. You have cross-subsidization all over the place. The fact that it's here because we're a competitor, and by the way, I think you should be allowed to be in this business in your dereg arm. I also don't think you should subsidize nukes, but that's a different story. But it's inherent in the monopoly model. So if we're going to pull it all apart, let's pull it all apart.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess and I'll sort of move on a little bit from this issue of the resilience of the system, but a related question is the robustness of the electricity supply. And so, if we're going to have a network, I mean, we have to maintain supply equal demand at all times. Of course, we've also got to maintain voltage and frequency within tight tolerances. We've got to control reactive power and so on. These are very strict engineering requirements. And it's often said that we need to have dispatchable capacity, so capacity that you can control as part of the system in order to maintain the stability of the system. And in particular, thermal capacity, the inertia of thermal generators plays an important role, I guess, in maintaining frequency. It's often claimed that the renewable sources it makes it very difficult to maintain network stability. Now, if you're completely disconnected from the system, I guess it doesn't matter. But if you're part of the system, the question is, what can you do to sort of substitute for that? And do we need to have also a change in the pricing system to recognise these kinds of services that generators can provide?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think to maintain stability of the grid, and as long as we have customers that are connected, and we will for quite a while, there has to be a participation of large numbers of types of resources, whether they are thermal generation, other kinds of baseload generation, peaking generation, renewables, and then, what I was saying before about the locality, the mix is going to depend on where you are. So, if you're in West Texas with a lot of wind, you are going to need, more gas or something to balance out the system. And then these resources should get paid for their reliability contributions. I mean, if they are baseload, or if they are fast acting, if they have a fast ramp, they should be compensated for that. And I think the ISOs generally try to get that right. But I think that the pressure becomes too, as technologies are different, they create different products, and then you get too many products. So, I mean, and we've seen that before. I remember years ago, I was working for a power plant in Zone J, which is in New York City, and it provided that particular plant, because of the transmission constraint, they needed fast-acting ramp services that were 15 minutes. They didn't have a 15-minute product at that time. So we had to create, just for this one unit, a type of service, and they got recovery for that. Which is kind of a pain if you have a bunch of local constraints. So you can get kind of an ennui of all these different products. But I think it is important, though, that each of these resources, they do get compensated. And I know in several FERC proceedings, FERC is trying to help people get it right and make sure that storage is compensated for, what it contributes to the system, and other resources, because certainly with more intermittent resources on the system, more distributed energy, there's much more of need to have these balancing and ancillary services.
I completely agree. Part of the market that needs to be shown is providing ancillary services. So reliability would be taking the form of combined cycle gas plants that are fast ramping. By the way, I ran a little utility system a long time ago, ripe age of 22. So I learned a lot, just because you push a button, Joe, it doesn't come on, right? You know that. And there's a lot of physical challenges with having just have somebody plug in a solar system and swing off the system, like your system. You should be compensated for that. If there's some ability with a battery in that case that can supply some of the stability, the ancillary services, that market should be open and shown those price signals. Solar and batteries could also do a very good job of addressing load pocket issues in a very cost-effective way, as many utilities have acknowledged. So again, make it a market, show it out, show the price signals out there for both energy and reliability, and my bet is very strongly that consumers will win. That's all I'm saying. I will also support that I think there needs to be service providers of financial consequence that homeowners must sign up for, so that we have an obligation, and it should be an obligation, to deliver information, production, and load to the ISO, to the RTO, or to the control area utility, so that they can better manage the system. Having been there in that seat and done that, I don't know how folks like Hawaiian Electric are actually doing it, other than they're just having a large amount of spending reserves, which has environmental and financial consequences to it. So again, technology is here. We need to have a structure that acknowledges that can deliver a better service at a better price to consumers, and then let the consumers choose who wins. But it doesn't mean that it has to be the end of poles and wires, and we certainly can be working together to make the system, again, more resilient and more cost effective for consumers.
Okay. There wasn't a lot of discussion so far. I guess often when you get into these discussions of the transition of the electricity system, another topic that comes up is smart meters and sort of incentives to handle some of these issues. Instead of doing it on the supply side, make demand more flexible. And another issue that related to that is what role electric vehicles might actually play in helping to stabilise on the demand side. I was wondering if any of you had any comments on those issues.
Yeah, I think the smart meter means different things in different places. And in New Jersey, we're not allowed as a matter of law to put a smart meter in. In Pennsylvania, we're required as a matter of law to put nothing but smart meters in. So some of this stuff is just depends upon the jurisdiction. But as we think about the electrification of the transportation sector, I think one of the interesting questions, Peter, is to what extent we could co-optimize the storage in the vehicles for grid reliability purposes. Quite obviously, no one wants to use up their car battery, supporting the grid, and then all of a sudden figure out they need to make a long trip and not have any gas in the tank, so to speak. So there are a lot of different technologies that are dealing with that right now. There's a good bit of innovation going on where perhaps you're just slowing down the rate of charging in some of these vehicles. But we do think electrification provides a long-term opportunity to get storage on site, both in support of solar facilities, but also in support of grid operations. The one thing we have not talked about, but it goes back a little bit to the market design and some of the challenges we have, is not necessarily around solar, which has a fairly stable profile throughout the course of the year. Obviously, we get less of it in the north just because we don't have that many hours of sunlight. But really around balancing wind resources. It's a phenomena that I don't think you deal with as much here in Texas because these resources tend to operate a lot better. But in PJM, if we took a look at that 13-state region for the last 5 years, what you would find is we have about an 85% failure rate of central station wind during August, which stinks because that's kind of when we sell a lot of electricity to people and they use the most of it in our region. So we have talked a lot today about the challenge of economically incorporating storage from a solar system that captures the energy during the day and then releases it at night for usage. And that there's probably a lot of different opinions about how quickly we could economically solve that challenge. I tend to agree with John that it's going to come more quickly than we expect. But we're not even close to being able to store electricity that was generated in April or in May and then use it again in August. So you said something that I think is exactly right. All of these technologies are very different. Wind and solar tend to be talked about the same way, but from a resilience standpoint, they're very, very different animals as we look at managing the grid. And one of the things that I think is going to be a feature of our markets for some period of time is some sort of centralized capacity planning or capacity resource market. It's something we have in different ways in different states, but uniquely not here in Texas. In MISO states in California, that resource adequacy is addressed essentially by the Commission issuing PPAs for combined cycle machines as they need it. In PJM, we have a market that is designed to attract investment and capacity, but it's a capacity market that has been fought off here in Texas for a number of years, and I've been in those battles. But as we just think about this world, and we may have different opinions about how fast we're getting there, but if we think about a world where we're increasingly introducing zero-cost marginal machines, nuclear, hydro is already there, wind and solar coming on, then as a practical matter, the marginal cost of energy in these markets has to trend to zero, right? If we had 100% renewables in the system, we would have a zero marginal cost, and there would be no energy revenue available in that market. Essentially means that the capital costs for renewables and any thermal generation have to be gotten in a different market. And either that's going to be a model where you have centralized planning through PPAs, or you're going to have some sort of capacity market design. I think before any of these other issues we're talking about get sorted out, that's a big one that needs to get sorted out, because we all understand more of this is coming. Now, some folks say, hey, Joe, forget about it. Not going to happen for a long time. But if you look at the market, it's failing to provide energy revenue adequacy already. It doesn't fail all at once. It's failing hour by hour. So in places like Arizona or West Texas, where 30% or more of the hours trade negatively, we have effectively a failure of that revenue model to support the needed capacity resources to keep the system. So capacity markets are a big piece. If you took a look at the DOE report, I invite you to really think a little bit more about energy price reform and a PJM white paper that was put out on this. But it begs the following question. Should we have negative prices in the market? In other words, should the market, when we're serving all of Texas, ever trade negatively? The reason it does today is because the tariffs in these jurisdictions prevent resources that are either coal plants at eco-min or nuclear plants from setting price. And so you may have a system in PJM that's using 60 gigawatts to support load, but the only resource on the market that's actually setting price might be a wind farm. And so PJM is trying to tell the wind farm to feather the blades when it has too much power, and it's pounding them with negative prices. Those negative prices sometimes go to negative $35 or negative $50 because wind farms have a different set of economics. They're chasing a federal subsidy, a state subsidy, or the combination of both. And as a consequence, it's driving down the cost of electricity, or the wholesale price of electricity, for 60 gigawatts because we're trying to move 500 megawatts of wind. What PJM is proposing is essentially this. Let's take the 500 megawatts of wind and pay them an opportunity cost not to run. We'll call that an ancillary service. So we will pay them not to produce electricity and feather the blades, and let the pricing for the other 60 gigawatts be set by the resources that are providing that service. That's the single most important issue in the wholesale market. And it's frankly important to any resource type at this point. That, I think, is something that DOE has said the record is done on. Elaine, you're right. We've gotten at this in different NOPRs. That's what's got to happen this year. We'll know if the Trump administration is advancing the ball, if it deals with that issue.
But isn't that, I mean, I guess I wonder if there's always political opposition to that. I mean, we've tried getting the capacity markets right in a lot of these organized markets for probably over 10 years. And, you know, there's still every time that as generators and having generator clients, we go in and say, you know, these guys, they need to get their return on their fixed investment. You know, we need a better, more robust capacity market or energy market. And what we hear back is, but you're still here. You know, why we still have generators participating, you know, so, but I think too, we've had, most recently, we've seen bankruptcies. And again, some of these companies, perhaps they were just over levered, but I think more people are going to be exiting the market, and hopefully can turn the tide with some of the political arguments.
I agree. You know, nobody gives you anything unless they realize there's a problem. There are a lot of reports out there that here in Texas we have about 15 to 20 gigawatts of central station gen that's not covering their costs. There's a lot of pain on the solar side. There's a lot of pain on the wind side. But until people stop building this stuff or start retiring generation, I frankly don't think we're going to get to those price reforms here in Texas necessarily. So it's unfortunate. It's just the nature of the beast that folks don't tackle a problem until it's right in front of them.
Okay, I want to, we're running sort of close to time. I want to move on to some of the questions that the audience have asked. And I have sort of grouped a whole bunch here together. I've got one for the nuclear industry, which is the big issue is cost overruns. What about the recent problems with construction costs and also handling wastes? And then I had a whole bunch of people asking different kinds of questions related questions about with respect to the solar industry. So when you come to talking about costs, a couple of questions. What were the drivers in the cost reduction that you talked about? And also, what about other elements of the cost, life cycle costs? Is there limited lithium supply? Is that going to drive up the cost of batteries? Can solar run higher power devices? How about the land needed to generate a lot of solar power? What is the trade policy with respect to solar panels? What's that going to do to costs? Or more generally, what might the Trump administration policies do to solar costs? So I guess some of our audience wanted to challenge nuclear and some wanted to challenge solar. So I guess I'll give you each a chance to answer
Well, as I said, we're in a bunch of different businesses, but I'll take the nuclear one as I think is appropriate. I think when you look at nuclear new build, the proposition, the economic proposition for it is, I would say the naysayers are leading the pack at this point. Very clearly what's happened with Westinghouse in the 4 units that are being in the Southeast is a black mark. As you look across the world, however, that's not the story. The Chinese are effectively building these, so are the Russians and South Koreans on time and on budget. But we did have a failure there. I would anticipate that we will have cost overruns for a period of time. Should there be a nuclear renaissance to build additional machines here in the States, I would say to you that that's no different. I remember when the president first talked about transitioning the electric sector to solar panel power. That was President Carter, incidentally, in 1979. Do a Google research, you'll see that. But since that time, one of the reasons we've seen cost declines in solar is because we've poured a ton of money into building oftentimes what has been uneconomic solar, and John knows this as well as I do. The RECs for solar has traded, as much as $600 or more a megawatt in terms of state subsidies on top of the federal subsidies, but over time, that has reduced the cost. I'm not sure that the country has the appetite to have those sorts of economic failures as we build out the next generation of nuclear plants. And I'm frankly not sure I would recommend it. There is a difference to me in terms of looking at this problem set and saying, we have existing nuclear plants. They're the cheapest zero carbon resource we have at this point. Let's maintain them. Let's use them as a bridge to something else. And then going further than that and saying, well, let's replace them with new nuclear plants. I'm not sure the case has been made for that. But the fact that there have been cost overruns on the initial units in the United States should frankly surprise no one. I would anticipate we would continue to have those as we've had for every other technology that we've introduced and refined. But silver lining there, if you're pro new nuclear development, is, as I said, in other parts of the country, those problems, or other parts of the world, pardon me, those problems have been overcome, and folks are building a lot of new nuclear plants.
Well, Joe knows a lot more about nuclear than I do, so I'm not going to make too many statements on it. What I would say is that at $3 an M gas, and if I'm right and others are right that it's going to go lower than that, whether it's $2.50 or $2. I know there's an environmental argument. Again, that's not what really drives me per se. I would say that gas does a lot better job than nuclear economically, and we should be putting more of our capital into the higher returns that can in turn lower costs for consumers. Nuclear is not cost effective even with sunk costs that's been paid for at least a couple of different times on the old plants, and that's why subsidies have been granted in some cases, right? So I think it was a nice try, but it didn't work. I think after the first nuclear plant in the 1950s, after almost 70 years, it didn't work. Let's move on. Good thing is the fracking guy sounds like while they have put a lot of money up front to get the technology costs down, just like we did, I certainly acknowledge that. I think that's true across the board with any technologies. They've done a fantastic job on the fracking side, and they're going to continue, as I've said. So I'm very comfortable with not having another nuclear plant built, and to indeed let the market work. And if they can't make the existing plants can't make the money, then shut them down. Go get some more gas.
Did you want to comment on any of the solar issues?
Yeah, there was a whole list. Which one would you like me to?
Well, maybe what are the main drivers of the cost reduction and the sort of trade moves against the panels? What's that going to do to your costs?
Yeah.
I think they may be the.
Yeah, look, on the cost side, we've got a lot of different components, and now with batteries, we've put in something that's more than just a new component. It really changes a lot of things in terms of how solar is sold, how it can operate, even within the grid system and so forth. And that was fundamental. We just figured that out this year, as far as my company, that batteries are a real true game changer because we can supply power at night. That's a big difference. And I'm not making light of it. It truly changes a lot of things for us. And the panel itself is becoming candidly the dumbest part of the system. It's the most known because it's out there and it's visible and it's big, but the inverters and the other control technologies, particularly those that operate with the batteries that are now coming in, are way more sophisticated technology that the U.S. Should and does lead in, by the way. The Chinese are catching up, and very quickly. But in terms of the trade issue, the first tariff, we're living with a tariff on solar panels right now. The Obama administration put what I term the Obama tariff on solar panels, mainly coming and really solely coming from China. Our panel costs have therefore been, instead of 25 cents a watt in Asia, all over Asia, been historically more like 35 cents a watt. They've recently, in the last 4 or 5 months, have gone up to almost 50 cents a watt again because of the threat of yet another tariff. And this tariff applies to the entire world. And the reality is, and this is something that all folks in business ought to be very careful of, is the Section 201 of the trade code. The barrier for injury is very low. Basically, GM could have filed for being injured by Toyota because Toyota sold a car that they didn't get to sell. And that's why the labor unions across from agriculture and steel and so forth have signed up in support of this, which is really a petition brought by a couple of hedge funds. And truth is stranger than fiction. The two solar panel companies in the United States that brought this, one's Chinese and one's German. You can't make this stuff up. And then the hedge funds out of the Isle of Man, they write a letter. I don't know why you're supposed to, when you blackmail somebody, you're supposed to just tell them verbally if you're into that thing. I'm not. But they wrote a letter to the Chinese and said, give me $50 million and this all goes away, when they're going after the entire world. So the Chinese are rightfully saying, well shouldn't everybody chip in if we're gonna go and do this? This case is crazy that it's there. And the big fear is that what I've said to a lot of senior leadership in the administration and Congress is this is Pandora's box for the entire U.S. economy. We cannot allow this to happen, and that's why I've opposed it so strenuously. Again, my capitalistic bent. I'm going to be a capitalist through and through, even when it's against me. I think I've proven that. Everybody can at least acknowledge that with opposition to the ITC. This is something that simply should not take place. And indeed, the market was already working. I mean, the Chinese cost and the U.S. cost, particularly in Houston, Texas, of all places, is a good spot because of our location and our history with the chemical industry. And so we're used to dealing with a lot of chemicals that are very toxic in nature and so forth. So this is a good place to get permitting and lower cost labor and so forth. So a lot of the Chinese firms were already looking at Texas to come in, as a matter of fact. And so the market was already moving, so we don't really need to do a tariff. Now, who does a tariff hurt the most? It hurts utility scale solar the most, because the percent of the total, the cost, turnkey cost, as we term it, EPC, engineering, procurement, construction, the equipment cost is 2.5x that in terms of percentage of the cost in utility scale than it is in residential. So what's the impact for us? Places that have just now become cost effective, like Texas, it could hurt those markets and shut them down and turn them back a couple, 2-3 years, maybe sooner, because putting these facilities up takes 6 months. This is not a lot of capital when you do a solar panel manufacturing facility, and it can go very, very quickly. What that will also do is contribute to the global glut of solar panels. So those of you who are like, I've got several friends, yay, I want tariffs because I'm in the gas business or the other power, the utilities. Although I will say this, NextEra and a few other utilities have signed up on my side on this. I think Exelon's probably supportive of no tariff as well, so I appreciate that. But when you look at everything that's going to happen here, if you are opposed to it for that reason, what you're only doing is buying yourself at most 18 months. And then you're going to have an even further price drop than where you see right now, because you're contributing artificially to the glut of capacity globally. So again, get government out of the business, let the market work, let the consumers choose.
Yeah, I guess I'll just echo that, though, on the kind of the scariness of this whole Sonova proceeding. I think when it was first filed, I think a lot of folks didn't think anything was going to happen. It was so unusual to have any kind of action under 201, where the barrier is very very low. It's not like a dumping case where there's a definite higher burden. So I think it kind of goes to kind of be careful what you wish for. A lot of people ask for government intervention, and we're going to see that in different ways, and it's come through in other areas too. In particular, like with siting new transmission and distribution and other things.
Okay, well, unfortunately, I had a lot of great questions here, but we can't get to them. We've got to wind up. Been given the wind-up signal. So it's time for you all to have lunch, which is going to be outside in the tent at the front of the Baker Institute. And then we want you all back here at 1 o'clock this afternoon in the Commons, where Secretary Baker is going to be giving the keynote speech, another speech.
Enjoy your lunch.